Welcome everyone. Pause right here, because what if the boldest act of peaceful defiance in American history, a law designed to humble the mighty empires of Britain and France without firing a single shot, instead shattered our own economy, idled an entire generation of sailors, and then, against all odds, ignited the very first sparks of the American Industrial Revolution, turning ruined merchants into pioneering factory owners who would one day outproduce the world. Hello friends and fellow Americans tuning in from coast to coast. Whether you're in bustling New York, historic Boston, the sun-drenched fields of Virginia, or the growing towns along the Great Lakes, grab a seat, settle in, and let this tale unfold like the rolling waves off our eastern shores, vivid, dramatic, and packed with the real heartbeat of our young nation in its most turbulent hour. Picture the creak of wooden hulls, the scent of salt and tar, the distant thunder of political storms in Washington, and the quiet clatter of looms that would change everything. This is the story of the Embargo Act of 1807, not as dry dates on a page, but as it lived and breathed through the lives of ordinary men, women, and families who felt its crushing weight and unexpected gifts. It's a tale of backfire and rebirth, of desperation that forged innovation, and of how one misguided law accidentally set America on the path to becoming the manufacturing giant we know today. Let's step back together into 1807. The sun was just dipping below the horizon on a crisp December evening in Salem, Massachusetts, when Captain Elias Hawthorne stepped off the gangplank of the Sea Witch, his prized brigantine, laden with the last legal cargo it would ever carry under the American flag. The air hung heavy with the familiar tang of codfish and rum from the West Indies, but something was wrong, ominously wrong. Whispers had raced through the wharves all day like wildfire through dry tinder. President Thomas Jefferson had pushed Congress to pass a sweeping embargo, banning every American ship from sailing to foreign ports. No exports, no imports from the belligerents tearing Europe apart in the Napoleonic Wars. It was meant to starve Britain and France into respecting our neutral rights, to end the humiliating impressment of American sailors and the seizure of our vessels on the high seas. But as Elias stood there on the rain-slicked docks, watching dock workers unload barrels of molasses and bolts of English broadcloth under the flickering lantern light, he felt the first chill of what was coming. Little did he know, this law would devour his livelihood, scatter his crew, and yet, years later, hand him the keys to a future he could scarcely imagine. Elias was no stranger to the sea's perils. At 42, with salt in his veins from a father who had sailed with John Paul Jones during the Revolution, he had built a modest fortune trading New England rum, dried fish, and timber for sugar, coffee, and fine textiles from the Caribbean and Europe. Salem's harbor was alive then, a forest of masts swaying like a living thing, the shouts of stevedores mingling with the cries of gulls. But the world beyond was on fire. Napoleon Bonaparte's Berlin Decree of 1806 had declared Britain under blockade, threatening to seize any neutral ship trading with her. Britain struck back with orders in council, blockading French ports and claiming the right to stop American vessels anywhere. Worst of all was impressment. The British Navy, desperate for men after Trafalgar, had kidnapped thousands of American sailors, claiming they were deserters. The Chesapeake Leopard affair that June had pushed the nation to the brink. The British frigate Leopard fired on the USS Chesapeake right off Virginia, boarding her and dragging off 4 men in broad daylight. War fever swept the country, but Jefferson, ever an idealist, chose economic coercion instead. Peaceable coercion, he called it, a grand experiment in moral force. On December 22, 1807, the Embargo Act became law, closing every U.S. port to foreign trade. Ships already at sea had to return or face seizure. Coastal traders needed bonds twice the value of their cargo just to move goods between states. It was total, absolute, and as Elias would soon learn, utterly devastating. Word spread like a nor'easter that night. In the crowded tap room of the Derby Tavern, Elias gathered with fellow captains and merchants, men like old Josiah Peabody, whose fleet of 3 schooners had once dominated the China trade, and young Silas Grant, a hot-headed first mate who had lost a brother to a British press gang. "This is madness," Peabody roared, slamming his tankard down so hard the ale sloshed onto the scarred oak table. "Jefferson thinks he can starve the lions of Europe with our empty bellies? We've got 30,000 sailors about to starve right here at home." Elias nodded grimly, his mind racing to his own sea witch and the Abigail, named after his wife, now idle at the pier. His cargo of West Indian sugar, worth a small fortune, would rot if he couldn't sell it abroad. Farm prices in the countryside would plummet without export markets for grain and cotton. The South's planters, reliant on British mills for their raw cotton, would scream betrayal. But New England, the heart of American shipping, would bleed worst of all. The first weeks were chaos laced with denial. Elias and Abigail, his steadfast wife of 18 years, sat by the hearth in their modest Federal-style home on Essex Street, the fire crackling as their 2 children listened wide-eyed. 13-year-old Nathaniel dreamed of captaining his own ship someday, while 11-year-old Eliza, with her quick fingers and sharp mind, already helped her mother card wool from local sheep. "We'll weather this, love," Abigail said softly, her hand on Elias's calloused one. "The president says it's for the nation, for our honor." But honor felt cold when the Sea Witch's sails were furled for good, her crew of 20 paid off with the last of Elias's coin and sent trudging into the winter streets. Unemployment exploded. Harbors from Boston to New York filled with ghost fleets, hundreds of vessels swinging at anchor, their decks silent save for the lap of waves against barnacled hulls. Sailors begged for work on the docks or turned to odd jobs hauling timber. Farm families in the interior watched their wheat and flour prices crash. Exports that hit $108 million in 1807 would plummet to just $22 million by 1808. Douglas Irwin, the economist who would later study it, called it a staggering 5% of the young nation's entire gross national product. But numbers like that meant nothing to Elias when his creditors began knocking. Enforcement turned the law into a monster. Congress rushed through supplementary acts in January 1808, demanding bonds even for fishing boats and whalers. Revenue cutters patrolled the coast, and port collectors seized cargoes on mere suspicion. Jefferson, desperate to make it work, authorized the use of the Army and Navy. In Salem, Elias watched as customs officers boarded the Abigail unannounced, demanding manifests and threatening fines that could ruin a man. Smuggling became the underground heartbeat of survival. Up north, along the Canadian border, goods slipped across Lake Champlain in the dead of night. Flour, potash, even timber lashed to rafts under cover of fog. Coastal captains like Captain Bartley claimed accidental drifts to Nova Scotia, unloading rum and picking up British manufactures on the sly. Land routes through Maine and Vermont buzzed with wagons evading patrols, their drivers whispering passwords in taverns. Elias resisted at first. Loyal to the Republican cause, he had voted for Jefferson twice, but hunger has a way of rewriting principles. By spring 1808, with his savings gone and the children growing thin on cornmeal porridge, he joined a midnight run. Under a moonless sky, the Sea Witch slipped out of Salem Harbor, ostensibly bound for New York, but blown off course towards the Bay of Fundy. The hold was packed with dried cod and staves. They returned with contraband tea and cloth hidden beneath false decks. The thrill was electric, the risk terrifying. Capture meant forfeiture, imprisonment, even the lash for repeat offenders, yet it kept food on the table. Across the nation, resentment boiled. In New England, Federalists who had never trusted Jefferson's agrarian dream fanned the flames. Petitions flooded Congress, hundreds from merchants declaring the embargo worse than war. In Boston, crowds gathered at Faneuil Hall chanting against the dambargo, as they mockingly called it. Farmers in the South, unable to ship cotton to Liverpool, watched their fields rot while British warehouses overflowed with pre-embargo stockpiles. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, seized American ships in French ports anyway, claiming he was helping Jefferson enforce the law.
Britain barely felt the pinch. Her merchants pivoted to South America, and her navy kept impressing sailors with impunity. The embargo, meant to force respect for American neutrality, had instead isolated us, impoverished us, and made us the laughingstock of Europe. Yet amid the ruin, something extraordinary was stirring, something no one, not even Jefferson, had foreseen. In the North, where imported British textiles had once flooded the market, scarcity created opportunity. Factories that had been mere dreams began to take shape. Elias's brother-in-law, Jeremiah Holt, a quiet, bookish man who had tinkered with spinning wheels in his barn, saw the writing on the wall. With British broadcloth now impossible to buy legally, demand for homespun soared. Jeremiah had read about Samuel Slater, the British immigrant who had smuggled textile machinery designs into America years earlier, building the first water-powered mill in Rhode Island. Now, with no competition from Manchester, capital flowed into domestic industry. Jeremiah convinced Elias to invest what little remained of their family savings, not in ships, but in looms and water wheels along the Merrimack River. "The sea has turned against us, Elias," Jeremiah argued one rainy afternoon in their parlor, unrolling crude blueprints by candlelight. "But these machines, they could spin our future right here on American soil." Eliza, wide-eyed, begged to learn the trade, her small hands itching to work the shuttles. The transition was grueling. Elias, once a master of tides and trade winds, now waded through muddy mill sites, overseeing the construction of a modest cotton mill in nearby Lowell, land that would one day become the cradle of America's textile boom. They hired displaced sailors as laborers, men grateful for any wage after months of idleness. The first spinning jennies arrived from secret forges in Connecticut, their gears clanking like a new heartbeat. Wool from local sheep and cotton smuggled from the South fed the machines. By late 1808, their mill was producing coarse yarn and simple fabrics, nothing fancy, but enough to clothe New England families who could no longer afford imports. Word spread. Other merchants in Providence and New York followed suit, pouring idle shipping capital into forges, ironworks, and glasshouses. The embargo's prohibition on imports had inadvertently shielded and nourished America's infant industries, just as Alexander Hamilton had once dreamed in his Report on Manufactures. Textile mills proliferated in the North. By the end of the crisis, investments that might never have happened were pouring in, laying the groundwork for the Lowell mills and the factory system that would define the 19th century. It was the ultimate irony. A law meant to punish Europe was birthing American self-reliance. But the human cost mounted relentlessly. In the summer of 1808, as enforcement tightened with yet another supplementary act allowing seizures without warrants, Elias's smuggling runs grew bolder and more dangerous. One foggy night off the coast of Maine, the Sea Witch was pursued by a revenue cutter. Cannon fire cracked across the water, warning shots that whistled overhead like angry hornets. Nathaniel, now 14 and eager to prove himself, manned the tiller as Elias barked orders to jibe the sails. They escaped into a cove, hearts pounding, but the close call left Abigail sleepless for weeks. "This law is tearing us apart," she whispered one dawn as they watched the children sleep. Across the country, violence flared. In upstate New York, farmers rioted against customs agents. In New Orleans, port officials clashed with smugglers in bloody skirmishes. Jefferson, once hailed as the champion of liberty, now faced accusations of tyranny from his own party. His Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, had warned him privately that the embargo would fail, but loyalty held the administration together, barely. Fall brought election fever. James Madison, Jefferson's chosen successor, won the presidency in 1808, but the Federalists surged in New England, decrying the Virginia dynasty's folly. Petitions piled higher. In Congress, debates raged like summer storms, Republicans defending the experiment as a noble stand for peace, Federalists painting it as economic suicide. Elias, torn between his Republican roots and the empty bellies in his home, rode to a town meeting in Salem where speakers decried the ruin of our commerce. Yet even as anger swelled, the mills hummed on. Jeremiah's operation expanded, employing 20 men by Christmas, former sailors now carding and spinning, their calloused hands adapting to new rhythms. Eliza thrived there, learning to operate a loom with a grace that astonished her father. "Papa," she said one evening, holding up a bolt of sturdy American cloth, "this is our victory, not the sea, but the land and our own hands." By early 1809, the embargo's days were numbered. Exports had collapsed, smuggling had become an open secret, and public outrage threatened to fracture the Union. On March 1st, just days before Jefferson left office, Congress repealed it, replacing the total ban with the Non-Intercourse Act. Trade could resume with all nations except Britain and France, a partial lifeline. Bells rang in harbors from Portland to Charleston as ships prepared to sail again. Elias stood on the Sea Witch's deck that spring morning, the embargo lifted at last, and felt a bittersweet rush. His fleet would sail once more, but the world had changed. Britain and France had not budged on impressment or seizures. The stage was set for the War of 1812, when those same issues would explode into open conflict. Yet in the quiet mills along the rivers, the true legacy endured. Domestic manufacturing, once a fragile sapling, had taken root. The embargo had backfired spectacularly on shipping and agriculture, but it had inadvertently shielded and nourished America's industrial birth.
Years later, as Elias watched Eliza manage her own weaving workshop in the booming town of Lowell, now a hub of water-powered factories employing thousands, he would reflect on those dark days with a mix of sorrow and wonder. The ruined ships had given way to humming spindles. The idle sailors had become skilled mechanics. Nathaniel captained a coastal trader, but his sister's looms wove the fabric of a new America. The Embargo Act of 1807 had devastated the present to forge the future, a total failure in its stated aims, yet a hidden triumph in sparking the manufacturing boom that would propel the United States onto the world stage. It was a lesson in unintended consequences, carved into the soul of the nation. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as disasters. And so, dear friends, as the sails of history unfurl once more in our minds, remember this chapter, not just as policy gone wrong, but as the quiet revolution that helped make us who we are. The sea's losses became the factory's gains, and America's spirit proved unbreakable. Now, I turn to all of you watching or listening. What kind of story would you like next? A daring revolutionary heroes, the wild frontier of the Louisiana Purchase, the thunder of the War of 1812 itself, or perhaps something from another corner of our rich American past? Be sure to comment below and let us know. Your voices shape these journeys. With the warmest wishes for strength, curiosity, and prosperity to every one of you, may your own histories be filled with unexpected triumphs. Until next time, God bless America.